So hello and welcome to this NPTEL lecture on Introduction to Cultural Studies, where we're looking at Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. We have already started with the text. We'll just continue with the text with the discussion today, and in a couple of lectures to come as well. So on page 21 on your screen, 22 actually on the screen, we have a definition of gender that Butler offers. It's a very interesting definition, and it's related to what we just talked about in the previous lecture about gender being a process, so gender being a verb, as an activity of becoming, unbecoming, rebecoming, obviously in relation to the cultural conditions around the human self, the human body. So Butler defines gender over here on page 22 as a complexity whose totality is permanently deferred, never fully what it is at any given juncture in time. An open coalition then will affirm identities that are alternately instituted and relinquished according to the purposes at hand. It will be an open assemblage that permits of multiple convergences and divergences without obedience to a normative telos of definitional enclosure. So the very idea of gender, according to Butler, is a play whose totality is permanently deferred. And if you remember, in the previous lecture, we discussed a section where Butler raised a suspicion against any sense of unity, any sense of universality, and she had warned us against the universalizing tendencies of looking at the category of the woman by completely doing away with the localities of existence, localities of experience, etc. And she had warned us against any essentializing technique that might be incorporated in understanding gender. And gender over here obviously is defined by Butler as a play and whose entire purpose is to defy totality, is to do away with totality, to do away with closure as well. So any normative closure is done away with in the idea of gender, according to Butler. So it's an openness, it's an open activity which does away with closure. And then she talks about, very interestingly, about intelligible persons or intelligible genders. So obviously gender becomes an activity inside an economy of stereotypes, inside an economy of identities, inside an economy of signifiers. So persons, and this is on your screen, persons only become intelligible through becoming gendered in conformity with recognizable standards of gender intelligibility. So there are certain recognizable standards, apropos of which people conform to, and in the process of conforming, they become intelligible persons, intelligible genders. So intelligibility becomes an act of conformation or conformity, right? And that's something that Butler is trying to deconstruct over here, the very act of conformity, a very act of conforming to standard stereotypes of identity, intelligibility, etc. And then she goes on to say, within philosophical discourse itself, the notion of the person has received analytical elaboration on the assumption that whatever social context the person is in remains somehow externally related to the definitional structure of personhood, be that consciousness, the capacity for language, or moral deliberation. So Butler describes how in analytical philosophy, how in classical philosophical discourses, the person and the environment are always defined in terms of an inside and outside. So the very idea of a social context is defined as being external to the person, right? Now Butler obviously is looking at a more post-structuralist way of embodiment in which the very idea of externality disappears. So the internal person and external environment sort of blend into each other in the idea of identity, in the play of identity, in the play of gender, etc., according to Butler. But she obviously is more critical of the standard philosophizing techniques in philosophical discourses, where the very idea of the context remains external to the person, remains external to consciousness, to language, etc. And that's something that she has problems with. And that again obviously brings us back to one of the key things that we've been talking about since the very inception of this course, and that is looking at culture as a mixture, a very problematic mixture of inside and outside, of abstraction and materiality, whereby the very differences, the very borderlines between inside and outside blur away. So the very borderlines between the material environment outside and the phenomenal consciousness inside, they blur away because they enter into some kind of a loop with each other. So consciousness is informed by materiality, and materiality is informed by consciousness, according to this kind of a very post-structuralist way of looking at identity in cultural conditions. Okay, so Butler then goes on to describe, and this is page 23 on his screen, highlighted in yellow, where she says, inasmuch as identity is assured through the stabilizing concepts of sex, gender, and sexuality, the very notion of the person is called into question by the cultural emergence of those incoherent or discontinuous gendered beings who appear to be persons but who fail to conform to the gendered norms of cultural intelligibility by which persons are defined. Now, we just saw how conformity, or the very act of conforming to the standard expectation, to the standard identifiers of identity, personhood, etc., how that act of conformity creates intelligible identities or intelligibility in standard discourses. However, what if that kind of conformity is reconstructed? What if someone refuses to conform? What if someone becomes a non-conformist into that category of identity? What if someone becomes incoherent or discontinuous in terms of gender identity? What that does, essentially, according to Butler, is that creates an emergence of non-intelligibility. So intelligibility over here is obviously a discursive category. Intelligibility is obviously here a recognizable category in an economy of pseudotypes, an economy of identifications, etc. Now, when that intelligibility is deconstructed by acts of non-conformity, through acts of incoherence, through acts of discontinuity, then gendered beings who appear to be persons fail to conform to the gendered norms of cultural intelligibility by which persons are defined. So the very act of defining persons, personhood, is defined through certain acts of conformity, certain acts of being in sync with standard notions of gender, standard notions of identity, etc. And that's a very important category according to Butler. So intelligible genders are those in which, in some sense, institute and maintain relations of coherence and continuity among sex, gender, sexual practice, and desire. Right? So she makes over here a very interesting definition between intelligible genders and non-intelligible genders. Right? So intelligible genders obviously are produced through acts of conformity, through acts of, by conforming to certain discourses which are familiar, or discourses of familiarity, etc. So, that is reliant on coherence and continuity and, symmetry and conformity, etc. Now, in other words, the specters of discontinuity and incoherence, themselves thinkable only in relation to existing norms of continuity and coherence, are constantly prohibited and produced by the very laws that seeks to establish causal or expressive lines of connection among biological sex, culturally constituted genders, an expression of effect of both in the manifestation of sexual desire to sexual practice. So the very idea, and we talked a little bit about in the previous lecture about the difference between biological sex and gender, in the sense that how gender becomes more of a play which is not overdetermined by biological sex, according to Butler. So gender becomes a performance whereby a man can become feminine, a woman can become masculine, depending on the performance, depending on the play of certain codes which are pre-established in cultural discourses. Now, obviously, intelligibility over here, or intelligible genders or intelligible identities of gender are reliant on a very coherent, continuous replication of those codes, and the opposite is true as well. So non-intelligible genders, non-intelligible identities are those identities which break or interrupt the intelligible codes, and that's something that Butler spends a lot of time discussing and deconstructing. Now, and then she comes over to the idea, the question of the woman, and we talked about in a previous lecture how Butler is very skeptical about looking at any kind of essentializing techniques or any essentializing tendencies or any universalizing tendencies towards woman or the question of woman, and she is more concerned with looking at woman as a topical category, as a constructed category, which is which is reliant on its context, which is tied to its context, which cannot possibly be divorced from its context, etc. Now, then she goes on to say in this particular section, which is page 25 on the screen, highlighted in yellow, where she says woman can never be, according to this ontology of substances, precisely because they are the relation of difference, the excluded, by which the domain marks itself off. Women are also a difference that cannot be understood as a simple negation or other of the always already masculine subject. As discussed earlier, they are neither the subject nor its other, but a difference from the economy of binary opposition, itself reused for a monologic elaboration of the masculine. So woman over here according to Butler, and she obviously is thinking in terms of the masculine economy, the patriarchal economy of identification, etc. Women over here are neither the other nor a simple, negation, right? So they're always defined in terms of a difference, and this difference becomes discursive in quality. So a woman can never be according to this ontology of substances precisely because they are the relations of difference. So being of a woman is negated by the fact that woman always lies in a relation of difference in relation to the patriarchal economy, right? So they are the excluded, they are the different, by which the domain marks itself off. The domain of patriarchal economy, the domain of masculinist economy, marks off the woman as the other, the different, etc. So women are also different that cannot be understood as a simple negation or other. So women are obviously not a simple other, or not a simple act of alterity over here, but they, as discussed earlier, they're neither the subject nor its other. So they neither occupy the subject position nor the neat other position. So they're always a liminal position between the self and the other, between the subject and the other, etc. And that liminality is something which is invested into this idea of difference. But a difference from the economy of binary opposition itself a ruse for a monological elaboration of the masculine. So the woman lies over here as existence of difference, as a relation of difference in relation to the binary opposition in the patriarchal economy. So they're neither the self nor the other, they're rather the liminal category, somewhere between the two, a play between identities, a play between normative and non-normative identities. And that, according to Butler, is a very crucial thing in understanding the idea of womanhood and in very post-structuralist terms. Now, next we come to this very interesting definition of gender, and this is page 33 in this particular book and highlighted in yellow for you on the screen, where Butler very clearly defines what gender is. And this is what I meant in a previous lecture when I said that we need to be very careful with Butler's use of verbs over here, because verbs play a very important role in Butler's discourse, because verbs are obviously an activity. Verbs denote activity, they denote a play, a performance, etc. And that is something that Butler is deeply interested in as a post-structuralist, as someone who's interested in a post-structuralist understanding of gender. And this is what I meant when I said in the beginning of this particular text that we need to look at Butler as someone who connects postmodernism with post-structuralism and gender studies. So she is someone who's quite seminal, really, as a figure, who connects gender identities or gender studies by drawing on post-structuralism, by drawing on postmodernism to a great extent, and that's why she is increasingly relevant in the world we inhabit today. Now, on page 33 on the screen, this is one of the foundational definitions of gender according to Butler, where she says that in this sense, gender is not a noun, but neither is it a set of free-flowing attributes. For we have seen that a substantive effect of gender is performatively produced and compelled by the regulatory practices of gender coherence. Hence, within the inherited discourse of the metaphysics of substance, gender proves to be performative, that is constitutive or constituting the identity that it is purported to be. In this sense, gender is always a doing, though not a doing by subject who might be said to pre-exist the deed. So gender over here is not a noun, neither it is a set of free-flowing attributes, but it's an act of performing. It's a performative activity to which subjects become, unbecome, and re-become, right? And obviously this becoming, unbecoming, and re-becoming is related to the idea of the economy of stereotypes, the economy of presupposed identities which are already there before a subject comes into being, right? So gender is always a doing, according to Butler. It's an activity. It's an incessant activity, though not a doing by a subject who might be said to pre-exist the deed. So it's a doing which creates subjectivity, which creates gender identities, which produces identities in a very interesting and a very embodied sense. So again, we're back to the idea of production, but obviously this production over here is potentially subversive, because the production of gender identities can be subversive in certain contexts whereby the human being or the human self does not conform to the idea of stereotypes which are pre-existing before the gender comes into being. So, and then she goes on to say, there is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. That identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results. So there is no preset identity in this particular context. That identity is something which is, performatively produced and performatively replicated and played by the human self in relation to the economy of stereotypes, in relation to preset identities. So this is obviously a very post-structuralist phenomenon, a very post-structuralist way of looking at gender, whereby if you go back to post-structuralism, which basically questions any causal, any linear relationship in signifier and signified. So this very neat equation between signifier and signified is deconstructed by post-structuralism, and Butler obviously is drawing on that deconstruction to a great extent when she's looking at gender identity, not in a causal linear way, but in a performative kind of a way, which plays up the pluralities, the plural possibilities, rather, of gender identities in a social context. Now, we had seen how Butler had looked at the difference between Irigaray and Simone de Beauvoir before, and she obviously is siding with Irigaray to a great extent. Louis Irigaray, the French feminist, post-structuralist feminist, some would argue, and Butler obviously is someone who is more akin, or more related, or more sort of allied, attitudinally speaking, with Irigaray rather than Simone de Beauvoir. Now, she goes on to say in this page over here, this is page 37 on your screen, where she says, the feminist appropriation of sexual difference, whether written in opposition to the phallococentrism of Lacan, which is something Irigaray does, or as a critical re-elaboration of Lacan, attempts to theorize the feminine not as an expression of the metaphysics of substance, but as the unrepresentable absence affected by masculine denial that grounds the signifying economy through exclusion. The feminine, as a repudiated, excluded within that system, constitutes the possibility of a critique on disruption of the hegemony conceptual scheme. Now, the hegemony conceptual scheme, or the conceptual schema, and obviously we have read Fanon before this, and we have seen how the conceptual schema can be racialized, can be epidermalized, according to Fanon. And over here, the conceptual schema, the hegemony of the conceptual schema is more often than not reliant on phallocentric principles. Now, the feminist appropriation of sexual difference is celebrated by certain feminists, the French feminists in particular, who are reliant on post-structuralism to a great extent. They look at the gender identity, the feminist gender identity, as an interruption, as an aporia in this narrative of phallocentric activity. So phallocentrism becomes the grand narrative, which is interrupted by this kind of feminist post-structuralist play of identities, which which repudiates the assumptions of the phallocentric economy. So the feminine, as a repudiated, excluded within that system, constitutes the possibility of a critique and disruption of the hegemonic conceptual scheme. So the possibility of critique lies in a disruption. So there's a very interesting equation the Butler offers between critique and disruption. So disruption or interruption becomes the origin of critique in certain sense. So critique relies on disruption, critique relies on interruption, and interruption obviously of the hegemonic grand narrative of masculinity, the grand narrative of patriarchy, the grand narrative of phallocentrism, etc. So all these grand narratives are critiqued and deconstructed by the exclusionary politics of the feminine as an exclusion, the feminine as an excluded category, obviously can create or can generate a productive subversion through this process of deconstruction. Right. So that's something that Butler is deeply interested in as a post-structuralist feminist, as a post-structuralist gender theorist over here. So, and then we come to page 42 on your screen, and this should be highlighted in yellow again, and where she goes on to say, the force of this practice is through an exclusionary apparatus of production to restrict the relative meanings of heterosexuality, homosexuality, and bisexuality, as well as the subversive sides of their conversions and resignification. Thus, the power regimes of heterosexualism and phallocentrism seek to augment themselves through a constant repetition of their logic, their metaphysic, and the naturalized ontologies, which does not imply the repetition itself ought to be stopped, as if it could be. If repetition is bound to persist as a mechanism of the cultural reproduction of identities, then a crucial question emerges. What kind of subversive repetition might call into question the regulatory principle, regulatory practice of identity itself? So she talks about heterosexuality and how heterosexuality allies itself with phallocentrism in terms of being dominant discourses of sexuality and gender, and how she says how can this kind of grand narratives be subverted? So these grand narratives can be subverted through practices of identity, through subversive reputations. Right now, if we look at this idea of reputation of grand narratives, reputation of logic, metaphysics, and naturalized ontologies. And naturalized ontologies, obviously ontologies which are naturalized through acts of repetition. And if you go back to Bhabha, Homi Bhabha's idea of the stereotype, where she says, where he had said that stereotype, and there's an ambivalence of stereotype in the sense that it's fixated. So, for instance, the violence or the anarchy or the hypersexuality or wildness of the black person is fixated as a stereotype, as an attribute. However, that attribute needs to be replayed incessantly or ad infinitum, because only through repeating that kind of a permanence can a stereotype gain currency in a colonial discourse. So the ambivalence lies in this play between permanence and play. So something similar is happening over here. So the naturalized ontologies over here, they need to be replayed over and over again by the patriarchal principles of production and reproduction, right? And unless you do that, unless you reproduce through this incessant play, incessant repetition, the phallocentric economy cannot gain currency or cannot gain legitimacy. So legitimacy over here becomes a discursive category, an aspirational category over here. So a dominant discourse can only gain legitimacy through reputation, through cultural mechanisms, reputations, reproductions, through cultural mechanisms, through media mechanisms, etc. Now, obviously, Butler is calling for the act of subversive reputation. So subversive reputation can interrupt and disrupt this idea, this currency, or this narrative of normalized ontology. So normalized ontologies become very important in Butler's discourse, because that's something that she critiques over and over again. That's something that she deconstructs over and over again. Normalized ontologies. So ontologies which are normalized through acts of repetition. So constructed categories which become given, which become grand narratives through acts of normalization. So normalization or naturalization become very, very discursive activities according to Butler. And obviously they try to conceal the constructed quality, they try to conceal the discursive qualities by acts of repetition. So the very idea of naturalization is related to the act of concealment. So you can naturalize something only by concealing its constructed category, its constructed quality. Now, if you reveal its constructed quality, if people find out it's a constructed category, then obviously they would stop to accept it as a given. They would stop to accept it as a presupposed idea, right? So any act of presupposition, any production of presupposition relies on naturalization, and obviously naturalization is related discursively to a concealment of the constructed quality of particular discourse. Okay, so and Butler as a post-structuralist, Butler as a postmodernist feminist, is someone who constantly questions these acts of normalization, these acts of naturalization. Okay. And then she goes on to say in page 44, which should be on the screen highlighted in yellow, where she says, this text continues then as an effort to think through the possibility of subverting and displacing those naturalized and reified notions of gender that support masculine hegemony and heterosexist power to make gender trouble, not through the strategies that figure a utopian beyond, but through the mobilization, subversive confusion, and proliferation of precisely those constitutive categories that seek to keep gender in its place by posturing as a foundational illusions of identity. Now, trouble over here is a key word, and this is something that obviously is part of the title, gender trouble. So trouble becomes a verb over here. Now, what does trouble do? Trouble unsettles oppositions. Trouble unsettles definitions. Trouble unsettles ontologies, etc. So trouble becomes a subversive category over here. So, if a certain definition is troubled, if a certain idea of gender is troubled, then obviously we are looking at new possibilities of meaning, new possibilities of production, which do away with earlier sort of ossifies or fixated ontologies of definitions of gender, which relied on a very neat binary between heterosexual, homosexual, between masculine and feminine, etc. So that binaristic system, that dualism, is something that is deconstructed by Butler in this particular book. So she is setting out over here to define what this text continues to do. So this particular text, Gender Trouble, it continues to unsettle this neat dualisms of gender, etc., and which are naturalized and reified. So reification obviously is a commodification, is a fixation. So if something is reified as a category, if something is reified as a meaning, then obviously what happens is it becomes fixated, it becomes frozen into some kind of meaning system which resists any kind of deconstruction. That reification is something which is resisted by Butler. Obviously that outer reification or naturalization is related to hegemony of masculinist hegemony and heterosexist power. So heterosexuality and patriarchy are conflated by Butler here as instruments in his idea of dominant discourses. However, this particular text wants to make gender trouble, wants to trouble gender, wants to trouble the idea of gender. So the word text is also interesting. So if we look at the word text and look at the word trouble, what Butler is trying to say over here very interestingly is that the textuality of gender is what could potentially trouble any neat idea of gender, which is reified and naturalized. So textuality and trouble are related to each other, as are naturalization and reification. So you're trying to construct again a four-term strategy that Bauer had constructed in the location of the other in that particular text that we did, the other question, the essay. But over here we can also draft a similar four-term strategy. So naturalization and reification as two terms which are conflated together, and text and trouble as two terms which are conflated together in opposition to the earlier category. Now textuality and trouble become related to each other over here according to Butler's discourse, and that kind of sort of compound, the compound between textuality and trouble can potentially subvert any idea of naturalization and reification. Now, however, Butler is also very interestingly warning us against any idea of a utopian beyond. So she's saying, making gender trouble or troubling the idea of gender doesn't aspire for a utopian beyond, but it aspires for a process through mobilization. Subversive confusion, again, a very important category, subversive confusion. So confusion or unsettling, which is subversive and potentially subversive in quality, in a sense that it will open up new possibilities of meaning in discourses of gender. And proliferation of precisely those constitutive categories that seek to keep gender in its place by posturing as a foundational illusions of identity. So the foundational illusions of identity is something that needs to be done away with, needs to be sort of opened up through a proliferation of new kinds of identity according to Butler. So obviously what Butler is trying to do here is, very interestingly, she's looking at how these ideas of reification and naturalization can be broken down, can be deconstructed, and we can have instead a proliferation of plural possibilities which will open up new ideas of gender through acts of mobilization without aspiring for a utopian beyond. Now, this resistance for a utopian, this resistance against a utopian beyond or a utopian understanding of gender is related to what Butler had warned us against precisely in that act of universalizing. So the very act of universalizing, the very act of becoming a utopia are things that Butler is warning us against. So she, on one hand, is someone who wants to critique the phallocentric dualisms of heterosexuality, homosexuality, masculine and feminine, etc. However, she's also equally skeptical of any kind of a utopian beyond, which can eventually end up being a universalizing tendency, can end up becoming a universalizing totality. Now, she obviously is something who is completely, anti-totality. So again, this anti-totalitarian identity is something that Butler, finds, there is a reason why we find Butler so relevant in the study of postmodernism as well, along with feminism, along with gender identity. So she's someone, again, who is equally important for postmodernists and for post-structuralists. Now, so this is something that Butler is interested in doing, and that's something that Butler, as a post-structuralist, is constantly aware of, that she is someone who's resisting gender, resisting a reification of gender, resisting any neat understanding of gender. However, she's equally resisting any utopian, utopian understanding of free gender. So the idea of a universal free gender, universal utopian gender, is something that Butler is warning us against constantly. So this concludes this lecture on gender trouble, and we'll continue with this book and hopefully conclude it in the next lecture. So just go to the yellow sections, the highlighted sections that we have studied so far, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.